Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. This week focuses on traveling beyond the line into the stanza and beyond the expectations. First, just to sort of review some terminology, I want you to try this matching practice. So go ahead and pause it and give it a try, and then I'm going to go through it. Don't cheat. Pause. Okay, here are the answers. Number 1, I caught this morning's minion king. Alliteration, MMM. Number 2, I shall not feel the rain, sing on as if in pain. This is going to be complete or perfect rhyme, rain and pain being exact rhymes. Wild spirit, which are moving everywhere. This is apostrophe addressing the wild spirit. As after sunset fadeth in the west. Iambic pentameter. We have unstressed stress for 5 feet. That means pentameter. Number 5, and hear the steam pipe knock like a metal heart. Simile. We have the word like, making a comparison. Using the word like or as, that's a simile. And absence makes the heart grow fonder. We all know that is a cliche. All right, hope you did well. Another way to test your knowledge is to practice writing. So this is an exercise you can pause and work on trying these different prompts that include some literary, poetic element terminology. Give it a try. I wanted to include this from Molly Spencer, who's a poet. She writes, sometimes I think writing actually gets harder as one goes along because one knows more. The more one knows, the higher one's standards for one's own work, etc. Well, anyway, what choice do we have but to keep at it? I've tried abandoning poetry, and it refuses to be abandoned. So every morning, it's back to the drawing board, even when it's painful, even when every effort is stillborn. So Molly Spencer's talking about this idea that when you know more, sometimes it becomes harder to write. And I know some of you write poetry, others of you, your main focus is another genre. I think we can all relate to this. The more you know, sometimes it can become harder to do it because you don't have that sort of unhinged freedom. Yet at the same time, the poetry gets better when you know more. So, and I think that's why it's harder, because you're writing even better stuff knowing what you know. And I think the overall message here is that you just keep writing, and not everything is perfect. My poetry professors in graduate school always said it's about 10 bad poems for every 1 good poem, and you should read 100 poems to write a good poem. So those were their parameters that they gave me, but the main point is it's not easy stuff, and sometimes we have to just write trash in order to get something that's the gem. Okay, we're moving on from the line to the stanza. So the stanza is sort of like a paragraph. Both of them have connected thoughts that are set off by space, right? They're in their own little section, and they're their own idea. The way that we describe stanzas is by the number of lines they have. So if a stanza is a couplet, 2 lines, tercet, 3 lines, quatrain, 4 lines, and so on and so forth. That's how we describe the stanzas. Stanzas allow poets to shift moods and present different subject matters in their poems. So if you wanted to make a big shift in the poem, you might do a stanza break there to emphasize that big turn. It's not just the turn of a line, it's a space. Like, we have to create space for that shift to happen. And also to shift to another subject matter, but that's still related in some kind of way. It helps you to make those jumps by using stanzas. In the past, when people wrote poetry, stanzas were symmetrical and expected. So we had certain forms like the sonnet, which was expected to be a certain number of lines in a certain way. Um, a lot of times, if you wrote in couplets, people expected your full poem to be couplets. If you wrote in quatrains, every stanza should be a quatrain. Contemporary poetry is different. It's allowed to be asymmetrical. It's allowed to be unexpected. It's encouraged. And I think the best guide is to see how it feels. Like, does this feel like it's just a one line stanza, or does this feel like it needs 4 lines to do what it needs to do? Um, does it feel like I want to have a uniform poem with all couplets, or do I want to throw a one line stanza in there to create this unexpected moment in the poem? Some things to think about for sure. All right, so I have some questions here for you to think through. The first is William's poem. It's on 239 to 245. It's quite long. And you'll notice the stanzas are maybe different than other things you have read in the past in this poem. And I want you to think about how they function in his poem. What do they do? How does each of them contain its own idea? Why does he make the breaks where he does between stanzas? And how does that create a bigger shift from one part to the next? And how does it affect the tone of the poem? To me, there's this very fragmented tone to the poem, sort of random thoughts, and some of them are continued, but it's very like stream of consciousness, like how our brain would work. Like, here's a couple lines. The dress, in which the veritable winter walks in spring. Loose it, let it fall where it will, again. A live thing, the buds are upon it, the green shoot come between the red flowerets curled back. Under whose green veil, see how it's kind of like that train of thought, that fragmentation. Look at it a little more closely and see what you think. The other question on page 250, we have a poem that is just one stanza. It's a tercet, it's 3 lines. And why do you think it's only one stanza? And how do the silence and space around the poem, like the lack of other things in the poem, affect the meaning of the poem, that it's just these 3 lines? I want you to read that poem and think a little bit more about the power of him making that choice and how you might make those choices in your own writing. And my last question for you is on page 279. We have Sanger's stanzas from his poem Elegy of Midnight. Now these stanzas are long, with long lines. They're very breathy. Why? How does their length add to the feeling of the poem? How does it add to the momentum of the poem? If you look at this poem in comparison to Williams's poem that we were just talking about, how does it feel different? And how do those line lengths and those stanza lengths contribute to that? So these 3 poems are all very different in terms of stanzas. And that's why I wanted you to look at them and think through what your patterns are. Look at your poems. Do you write long lines? Do you write long stanzas? Do you write short stanzas? How many stanzas do you typically have in a poem? And whatever it is that's your pattern, I want you to try to do something different this week. Try to mix it up and experiment a bit more. Great segue to poetry experiments. We want to emphasize experimentation in this course because it does help you to expand your aesthetic and expand your ideas and your potential. You might not always stick with the experiments that you use, but the experiment itself may emphasize the next poem that you write in more of your sort of familiar voice or something. So everything begins as an experiment. That's what we want to emphasize first that all forms and all those inclinations we have as poets began as just an experiment, like the sestina form. It was an experiment. Someone was like, let me try this. Um, in what ways did the poems you read for this week seem experimental? So thinking about all the poems you read, the ones that we just talked about too, how can you see them sort of breaking molds? For instance, Williams was a part of the modern movement in poetry, and those poets sought to break against form and constraint. So his poem was seen as extremely experimental in that time. And maybe it still looks that way to you if you haven't read a lot of contemporary poetry or modern poetry. Um, but think about what are the parts that seem experimental, and what other poetry have you read or written yourself that felt experimental? And if you haven't written anything that felt experimental, why not try it now? Here's another way to experiment a bit in something you've already written as sort of a revision tool. So you can take out a poem and you're going to do three things, okay? You can pause this and do them. You're going to turn one stanza into an image so that the whole stanza is just this image. You're going to add a list to the poem as Williams does. So at some place you're going to just make a list of things, and you're going to add a symbol as William does. So these are ways to kind of play with what you already have, add some elements in, and stretch yourself a bit more. Last thought for this week, bad writing is better than no writing. Couldn't be more true. I know that sometimes the creative challenges of a course like this are sort of the hardest thing about it. It's not sort of the academic strain, but the sense that you have to create every single week. You have to be creating something, and maybe even daily creating something. So I encourage you just to write. It doesn't matter if it's bad. It doesn't matter if it's not about anything important. Who cares? Just write something, and that's always better than nothing. Have a great week.